The Bronx is the northernmost borough of New York City, with the Bronx originally being farmland back in the 19th century, during the time when there were not many houses for people to call home in the Bronx. That's until about 1905, when the subway system arrived, allowing the citizens of the Big Apple to commute more widely. This would cause a construction boom in the Bronx, leading to the development of properties on both sides of the subway, with the population of the Bronx at the time being around 200,000, a number that would quickly grow to around 1.3 million just 25 years later in 1930. This rapid growth can be attributed to a number of European immigrants who came to the US in search of a better life, with a large percentage of these immigrants being Jewish people, who were likely running away from persecution in the Russian Empire before World War II made things much worse. But as a result of these global discriminations going on through this period, the Bronx ended up being 49% Jewish in the 1930s and 1940s. Also around this time, a huge amount of Italian immigrants would come to the US in search of work and a better life due to high unemployment rates and taxes at the time in Italy. This is actually when we would start seeing Italian mobsters taking over New York City's criminal underworld, with the 5 major mafia families being established officially in 1931. And with this new influx of people, the borough would quickly urbanize. Fast forward a few years later to after World War II, in the 1950s, the Bronx would be seeing a major shift, which led to an economic decline in the area. This was mainly due to the construction of the Cross Bronx Expressway, the 6-mile highway which ripped straight through the South Bronx without regard to the families or businesses that were in its path, with the city removing 1,500 families and tearing down whatever was there. From here, more African Americans would move to the borough during what was known as the Great Migration, a period of time between 1910 and 1970 where millions of black Americans moved from the rural South to more urban areas in the Midwest, the West, and northeastern parts of the US, including New York City. This started a phenomenon that would become known as the white flight, which is where a large number of white people moved out of busy urban areas, a lot of the times opting instead to live in the suburbs, and ultimately having the consequence of a lot of the black and minority citizens being subjected to cramped and unsafe social housing projects, a form of institutional racism that's unfairly impacted black and minority citizens economically. In the 1970s, America went through significant economic stagnation, causing a serious economic upheaval in New York as the city lost hundreds of thousands of jobs and almost went bankrupt in 1975. Consequently, during this time, the city became riddled with high crime rates, and the Bronx in particular became synonymous with gang culture.
It all started up in the Bronx. In the Bronx, it was a deep-rooted gang culture.
In 1971, gang violence had escalated to a fever pitch.
There were gangs literally in every corner. The violence was everywhere. You could hear the shouting at nighttime.
It was a lawless time.
Crime was like the major income of the Bronx.
This is getting out of hand.
During this time, there would be dozens of gangs in the Bronx at this point, like the Savage Skulls, the Savage Nomads, the Black Spades, the Seven Immortals, the Midnight Bachelors, and the Ghetto Brothers. The escalating violence between these gangs would eventually lead to an exceptional peace treaty in 1971, after a member of the Ghetto Brothers called Black Benji, real name Cornell Benjamin, was killed while he was attempting to broker a peace deal between 2 gangs.
Word of the murder and fear of reprisals spread like wildfire.
All the gangs were there. At the 174th, they were waiting for the big war. We said, no, we're not gonna do anything.
We ain't doing nobody. Gotta figure out how we're gonna do this.
Representatives of over 40 of the city's most notorious gangs met at the Hoe Avenue Boys Club in the Bronx. At the end of this historic summit, an inter-gang peace treaty was signed by every attending leader.
Decades later, in 2023, Black Benji's sacrifice was honored by the city at the corner of 165th Street and Rogers Place, where Benji was killed, with the street actually being named in his memory. The peace treaty is often credited for bringing an era in the Bronx where the youth would finally get a chance to focus on more positive endeavors, including the arts, which would eventually lead also to the flourishing of the hip-hop culture.
Peaceful block parties hosted by the Ghetto Brothers and other local gangs began to multiply, helping to dissolve the invisible turf boundaries that had dominated for years prior.
Here's where the whole thing started to change.
However, the gangs weren't by far the only thing popping in the Bronx during the 1970s, as this was a dark decade where much of the borough was being burnt down, with some greedy landlords actually burning down their own properties in the hopes to collect insurance money, leaving thousands homeless in the already poor borough.
We grew up with burnt out decay all over us. The South Bronx was burning down around us, and nobody seemed to know why.
Everything south of the Cross Bronx Expressway, they just let it burn, and nobody gave a damn.
And all of a sudden, neighborhoods just went whoosh, gone. Nobody's aware of the fact that we got a city dump right here in the backyard.
Then in the 80s, the crack epidemic hit the USA by storm, affecting almost every major city in the country. But crack had a particularly big impact in New York, and as the drug rose in popularity, so too did the violent crime surrounding it. During this time, Ed Koch was elected as mayor, who focused on leading the city out of a severe fiscal crisis through austerity measures and revisiting the economy. And while he did restore some hope for the city, Ed's tenure as mayor did not come without its fair share of controversy. Scandals would begin that painted the mayor in a new light, as Koch's tenure was marked by strained race relations in New York City, with him at one point declaring that all black people were anti-Semitic and adding that Jewish people would be crazy to vote for Jesse Jackson. Koch was also highly criticized for the handling of the 1983 police shooting of Eleanor Bumpus, an elderly black woman who was dealing with mental illness. People believe that the investigation of this case was not impartial, due to the fact that the NYPD led the investigation for the shooting of Eleanor Bumpus. That, along with the fact that there was no body cam at this time, caused a justifiable raise of concern for this case, especially when 4 years later in 1987, the officer that shot Eleanor, Stephen Sullivan, was acquitted of all charges and reinstated back into the NYPD with full gun privileges. People believe that Koch should have stepped in and called for an internal investigation on this matter. This, along with numerous other scandals, the once good public perception of Koch would change to corruption and greed. And in the late 1980s and 90s, we would see the rise of new gangs such as the Latin Kings, who traveled to New York from Chicago, as well as the Bloods and Crips, who migrated to New York from Los Angeles. These gangs would move to various neighborhoods in Brooklyn, Queens, the Bronx, and Harlem, and all three gangs were involved in drug trafficking, violence, and recruitment of young members from marginalized communities. The rivalry between the Bloods and Crips in New York, for a time, would mirror the intense conflict seen on the West Coast, contributing to the increased gang violence in the city. And as the 90s was coming to an end, we would see a drop in violent crimes in the Bronx, this mainly being attributed to the decline of the crack epidemic, as well as an increase in police technology. And as we head towards the present day, the gangs of New York would begin to fragment, with a lot of gangs losing the structure that they once had, breaking off into smaller sets. Another major difference is the activities of the gangs. While drug dealing is still a major part of the criminal enterprise of these gangs, instead of crack, gangs would get into selling opioids, which is the predominant substance abuse epidemic that plagues the globe in the present day. In 2022, Eric Adams was inaugurated as the mayor of New York, and his time as mayor has been filled with controversy too. Since Adams became mayor in 2022, several concerning statistics and trends have emerged. For instance, robberies and felony assaults rose by 30% and 15% respectively in 2022 compared to the previous year, which was apparently caused by the COVID-19 pandemic, which affected the whole world. But Mayor Adams doesn't seem to make this link, with people accusing him of fear-mongering and hinting that New York is actually more dangerous than it actually is. The perception of safety on the subway system has also been a significant issue. Despite Adams' focus on improving subway safety, major crimes on the subway increased by 30% in 2022 compared to 2021, according to NYPD data. Adams would actually go to the Breakfast Club to address these concerns and attempt to clean up his image a little bit, but when he got there, he would be met by Oloyemi Olurin, a progressive attorney and advocate who challenged Adams on his rhetoric surrounding subway crime. She accused him of sensationalizing isolated incidents.
Yeah. I think you're right that there is a difference between perception and fact and how people feel about safety and the way people feel about the subways. And I think it's your own rhetoric about the subways that has a lot to do with why scared, despite the fact that millions of people ride the subway every day without incident. But you've continued to fearmonger about crime in the subways. You've added 2,000 police officers, despite the fact that you've acknowledged that the subways are not that dangerous.
When asked about it, Mayor Adams would kind of evade the question by asking another question.
Well, let's go before. First of all, I would love to give me the quotes on my rhetoric, because I'm lost on that. Can you give me the quotes?
Oh, that you fearmonger about the subways?
Yeah,
you've consistently done that since the day one of your administration. One of the first things you did was add 1,000 officers to the subway because you claimed that the subways are unrideable. You and Hochul did this and said how dangerous it is, and you recently did that when you deployed the National Guard.
Sister, but that wasn't my question, Queen. My question was, what was my fear mongering?
He would then go on to explain that her beliefs are not the overwhelming beliefs in the city.
You may say, Eric, I don't want to see a visible president of a uniform officer, and that's cool, but that's not what the overwhelming number of New Yorkers are saying.
To which she would respond with statistics proving how the city actually feels.
And I'm saying to you, the New York City comptroller, Brad Lander, recently put out a report finding that 50% of the city is disappointed and does not feel safe based on your rhetoric about the subways and your over-police presence.
As of September 2024, Mayor Adams has been indicted for federal corruption. And while we'll likely see things play out in the court, regardless of the status of Eric Adams' role as mayor of the city, corrupt or not, the reality is, whoever the mayor of the city is, they can't really do that much about the underlying culture in the streets of New York. The city's decades-long history of gangs operating in the streets mean that the gangs don't really care if the mayor is Rudy Giuliani or Eric Adams. They're still going to get busy and do what they gotta do. But one of the most interesting developments in the streets of New York City over the last 10 years is the progression of the music scene, more specifically, the emergence and evolution of drill music communities, starting in Brooklyn and eventually spreading to the Bronx. The Chicago-inspired subgenre we all know as drill music would ultimately end up grabbing hold of the city of New York, influencing generation after generation of teenage New York gangsters who were getting busy in the streets to pick up a microphone and start describing their lives too. So let's jump forward now and trace back the rise of murder music in New York to determine how and why gangsters started rapping there, and exactly why the rapping killers of New York City just keep getting younger and younger.